Why are the United States and Europe drifting apart in 2026? The answer lies in a fundamental shift in global power. For over 100 years, American industry and sacrifice guaranteed European security. But as American priorities shift toward the Arctic and the Pacific, the old transatlantic deal is collapsing. The Greenland controversy is not the cause of this rift, it is the symptom. This documentary explores why the divergence between Washington and Brussels was inevitable. The catalyst for this widening gap emerged in January 2026. Following clear signals of American strategic interest in Greenland, aimed at securing the Arctic flank against global competitors, major European capitals responded with a unified condemnation. Leaders from France, Germany, and the UK issued a joint statement framing the American move as a violation of sovereignty and international norms. To European diplomats, this was an unacceptable breach of the status quo. However, to strategists in Washington, it was a necessary step to secure the North Atlantic in an increasingly contested world. This diplomatic standoff highlights a critical paradox at the heart of the modern alliance. The nations criticizing this strategic maneuver are the same ones that rely on the American security umbrella to exist. While Europe focused on the legal and moral implications of the Greenland dispute, the United States was operating on hard security calculations. This event in 2026 was not an isolated incident. It was the moment where two different worldviews finally collided. To understand the rift of 2026, we must look beyond the headlines and examine the unspoken deal that has defined the Western world for decades. The transatlantic relationship was built on a simple, fundamental premise. American hard power would guarantee European safety. In exchange for this protection, Europe became a stable democratic ally and a massive economic partner. This security umbrella allowed European nations to thrive without the heavy burden of maintaining global military projection. While Washington spent trillions developing a force capable of operating in every ocean and on every continent, European capitals could prioritize social infrastructure and internal economic integration. It was a convenient arrangement for both sides, but it created a lopsided reality. Over time, the alliance transformed from a partnership of equals into a relationship of structural dependence. One partner became the global enforcer, possessing the logistics and firepower to act anywhere, while the other became accustomed to a world where security was provided, not produced. This dynamic held the West together for generations until the geopolitical landscape began to shift. However, the geopolitical map has been redrawn. By the mid-2000s, the United States began a decisive pivot toward the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic. Washington recognized that the primary challenges of the 21st century were no longer centered in Europe, but in the contest for technological and maritime dominance in Asia and the North. This shift fundamentally altered the calculation. American resources are finite. Every carrier group or fighter squadron committed to the Atlantic is one less available for the Pacific. The 2026 move on Greenland was driven by this new reality, securing the Arctic flank against hypersonic threats that bypass traditional defenses. For European leaders, this pivot felt like a betrayal of the old alliance. But for American strategists, it was a necessary evolution. The United States was no longer just the guardian of Europe. It was securing its own survival in a multipolar world. The divergence was not about malice, but about conflicting priorities in a changing world. But to fully understand why Washington is willing to risk its relationship with Brussels over Greenland, we must look at what lies beneath the ice. The conflict is not just about geography, it is about the raw materials of the future economy. The Arctic region holds an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its natural gas. More importantly, Greenland is home to some of the largest undeveloped deposits of rare earth metals on the planet. These are the critical components for batteries, advanced electronics, and defense systems. For the United States, allowing these resources to fall under the influence of strategic competitors is a non-starter. While European nations debate the environmental impact and sovereignty issues of Arctic development, the United States views the region through a lens of resource security. In a world where supply chains are weaponized, controlling the source of these materials is a matter of national survival. The 2026 dispute laid bare a fundamental difference in how the two sides view the future. Europe sees the Arctic as a protected preserve, while the United States sees it as a critical frontier that must be secured before rivals can establish a foothold. As Washington pivoted, a harsh reality set in across European capitals. The capability gap had become a chasm. For decades, the assumption was that American logistics and intelligence would always be there to fill the voids in European defense. But with U.S. assets committed elsewhere, those voids remained empty. The disparity is stark. While the United States continued to invest heavily in next-generation technologies, hypersonics, space-based assets, and integrated command structures, European defense spending remained fragmented. The issue was never a lack of wealth, the combined economy of the European Union rivals that of the United States. The issue was a lack of unified political will and industrial coordination. By 2026, this fragmentation meant that while Europe possessed advanced weaponry, it lacked the strategic enablers to use them effectively without American help. The continent had relied on soft power and diplomacy, assuming hard power could be borrowed. The Greenland crisis proved that when interests diverge, hard power cannot be borrowed, it must be owned. Compounding this capability gap is the fact that Europe is not a single, unified entity. The 2026 crisis exposed deep internal fractures within the continent itself, further complicating any response to the American pivot. While Western European powers like France and Germany led the condemnation of American actions in Greenland, the response in Eastern Europe was markedly different. Nations like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states view American security guarantees not as a luxury, but as an existential necessity. For Warsaw and Tallinn, the threat does not come from American assertiveness in the Arctic, but from the East. This internal division paralyzes European decision-making. When Paris calls for strategic autonomy and independence from Washington, Eastern capitals hear a risk of abandonment. They trust American tanks more than European promises. This lack of cohesion makes it nearly impossible for Europe to present a united front or to fill the vacuum left by the United States. As long as Europe remains divided on who its friends and enemies are, it cannot replace the security architecture that America is slowly dismantling. Beyond the military bases and diplomatic statements, a silent war is driving this wedge even deeper: the economy. For Washington, national security and economic policy are now one and the same. The United States has moved toward aggressive decoupling from rival powers, prioritizing supply chain resilience over free trade efficiency. Europe, however, remains built on the old model of globalization. Major European industries, from German automotive to French luxury, are heavily dependent on exports to the very nations the U.S. identifies as strategic threats. When Washington demands strict technology controls and trade barriers, European capitals see an attack on their prosperity. This fundamental disagreement creates a paralyzed alliance. The United States refuses to subsidize the defense of a continent that continues to enrich its primary competitors through trade. Europe refuses to destroy its own economy to suit American hawkishness. In 2026, this economic divergence has become as dangerous as any military gap. The U.S. sees Europe not just as a weak ally, but increasingly as an economic liability in the great power competition of the 21st century. The diplomatic fallout from the Greenland crisis in 2026 was not just a political dispute, it was a reckoning. It forced a conversation that had been delayed for 30 years. The Atlantic Alliance, once the bedrock of global security, has evolved into two distinct spheres of interest. America has chosen its path, a global posture focused on the Pacific and the Arctic, securing resources and trade routes for the next century. Europe is left with a choice that it can no longer avoid. It must either accept a diminished role on the world stage or finally summon the political will to become a true independent power. The era of automatic alignment is over. The expectation that Washington and Brussels will always see the world through the same lens has been shattered by the reality of divergent interests. The security guarantee that defined the 20th century has been replaced by a transactional relationship in the 21st. History does not wait for nations to be ready. The drift between the United States and Europe was not an accident, nor was it a sudden betrayal. It was the slow, inevitable consequence of a changing world order. As American ships patrol the Arctic and European leaders debate their next move, one fact remains undeniable. The bridge across the Atlantic hasn't collapsed, but for the first time in history, no one is crossing it to save the other side.